I'm in the Tynwald Chamber where both branches of the Parliament meet with Chris Thomas, MHK, who's calling for a referendum. Now, you want a referendum on constitutional reform. Allan Bell has already said that we don't need one and that people really aren't that interested in reform. What would you say to that?
When we had the Scottish referendum last September, 85% of people took part in that referendum, which is the largest ever turnout in the British Isles. That says something, but referendums do engage people. We've had 12 in the United Kingdom part of the British Isles, and each time there's been a reasonable turnout. So at the moment, people are disengaged from politics. They don't really care about the idea of constitutional reform. They care about the cost of living, they care about their income, they care about housing, they care about pensions, they care about those sorts of issues. But while Parliament addresses those issues, while Tynwald addresses those issues, I think it can't do any harm to address a serious issue of constitutional reform through a referendum.
The cost of a referendum, that's another issue that's been raised by Allan Bell, but you have a way around that, don't you?
Well, in 2016, we've got two general elections. In the spring, April, perhaps early May, we've got the local authority general election, so we'll have polling stations set up in any local commissioner area where they're going to have an election. On September the 22nd, we've got our national general election, so we've got two opportunities where the cost of a referendum is marginal. It's just on top of the existing infrastructure of returning officers and counts and room hire and all those sorts of things. Obviously, there is a cost, and if we're going ahead, it would be important to establish exactly what that cost is, but it's going to be nothing compared to organising an ad hoc referendum.
And your aim is to have what's called a unicameral parliament, where we have one body of people, one legislature. We no longer have an unelected Legislative Council. That's right, isn't it?
Yes, that's right. So we're in a unicameral parliament. Tynwald is unicameral. There's just one chamber. Once a month, all members of the Legislative Council, all members of the House of Keys come here, and we consider and decide issues of policy, issues of finance, secondary legislation. But then for the rest of the month, we actually separate into two chambers, Keys, downstairs, Legislative Council upstairs, and we actually have a very long legislative process. We actually have 8 readings, as they're called, of each particular piece of legislation. You know, that's the longest in the British Isles now. In Scotland, in Wales, in Northern Ireland, in Jersey, in Guernsey, they've reduced that substantially. Well, not quite the longest. Obviously, in the massive Parliament of Westminster and in the Dáil, they still, for the moment, have the same system as we have, but we're out of line with the majority of British Islands parliaments.
And would you be looking at fewer members?
That would be one possibility. So there would be 3 ways that costs could result from my area, but I'm not guaranteeing that they would, but there would be 3 ways. The most important is that I think we'd have a better legislative process if we changed the way we went about preparing legislation, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But there are 2 other ways. Firstly, if we could make do with fewer politicians, because we only have one chamber, that would be a direct cost. And the cost of running this parliament, members cost 3 times the amount of the rest of staff. So one less member is a saving, and so on proportionately, because members have pensions and salaries and so on. And the other cost is that our staff have to service 2 chambers at the minute, and servicing one must be easier, except that there is a very vital role of scrutiny, a very vital role of legislative review, so we would have to do that in any case.
I was going to ask you about that, because that's what LegCo does now, isn't it? Mm-hmm. It's the scrutinising chamber. So if you get rid of that and you have one chamber, mm-hmm. how would that work? So
the staff would still be supporting us to have proper legislative review, and the way that they do that in Scotland, in a way that works very well, and it's paralleled in Wales, to an extent in Jersey and Guernsey and Northern Ireland, is they have pre-legislative committees where at the stage when a new policy intention is being established for animal welfare or for landlord and tenant bill or something like that, they get together all the interested parties, the experts, the general public, the politicians, and they think about what the legislation needs to address. And then we go through the readings inside the House with a first stage, a second stage, and in those other parliaments, automatically, in some cases, at the stage after the second stage, the clauses stage, there's an automatic referral to a legislative committee. And that's perhaps what we would have in our single chamber parliament. The Legislative Council would become a legislative committee. We could perhaps have one, or we could perhaps have several for different policy areas. That's exactly parallel to what we did with the landlord and tenant private housing bill recently to address some issues that arose in that legislation. And then it comes back to the full chamber. So we would get down from 8 or 9 readings down to 4 or so. That might be quicker. Certainly it would, I think, lead to better legislation. The other advantage, the other disadvantage we've got with Keys at the minute is we don't have the Attorney General sitting with us. We have a clerk who's legally qualified, but we don't actually have the Attorney General. If we had a single chamber, we'd have the benefit of the clerk and the Attorney General. And so on. So that's the effectiveness of the process, the efficiencies in terms of saving money directly, but most importantly indirectly, because I think we'd have better legislation that would suit business better and every other interest group in society who needs good legislation.
Now, this has been tried before. We've had members trying for referendums before. We've had bills going through the House of Keys. How confident are you of getting your Tynwald colleagues' support on this?
Well, I've divided it into 2 parts, my motion. The first part is about setting up an independent inquiry, a commission. That's actually in Allan Bell's personal manifesto when he stood in 2011, and then he translated it with the support of his council and ministers' colleagues into the Government of National Unity National Manifesto, and he spoke about it 3 or 4 weeks ago in the Economic Policy Review Committee that he still believed in that. So I'm hopeful that we can actually have external independent review of where we are to produce options. I'm more confident of that part because to me, if it's in the government programme, why wouldn't everybody be supporting it? We don't need new consultants, we don't need even new investigation, we just need somebody who knows what they're doing, a bit like Sir John Elvidge did for government and the single legal entity and those sorts of processes. We just need perhaps even one person to come over, review where we are and give us options.
And the referendum?
The second part, the referendum, to me, if you have celebrated the success of the Scottish referendum in galvanising the country, to me you should believe in a referendum as well. Bringing politics back to the people is something that often politicians say, so I would hope that a referendum is equally attractive. 2016 is the opportunity because of the elections. That doesn't come around again. We don't have an election probably till 2020, so if we miss it next year, there's all sorts of historical parallels as well. By chance, 2016 might end up being called the year of democracy, especially if we can have a referendum. It's actually the 150th anniversary of suffrage in the Isle of Man, of having a vote. It's the 60th anniversary of actually the petitions for redress of grievance on Tynwald Hill being revitalised, and it's actually the centenary of what's called the People's Tynwald, when things got a bit out of hand on Tynwald Day and a bit of mud was thrown and so on during the First World War. So I'm excited. I think it's an opportunity. If it doesn't go through this time, I'm sure it'll be coming back. Obviously, the referendum can go either way. In Ireland, they had a referendum about exactly this sort of issue, and the reformers and the government was for reform, and the reformers lost. In Jersey, they had a referendum last October on their general election day on a similar type change, and that was lost. So to me, whether you support it or you're against it, it's still helpful to actually know what the people are thinking about an issue. I'm not advocating at this stage for a binding referendum. It's an advisory referendum, and to me, that might be something that can break what I've called previously the logjam or the deadlock in where we are. We've had 40 years of trying to change things through legislation or trying to change things through committees. Why not a referendum? Then politicians can't be confused about what people are thinking about it, and having the process of having a referendum will give the chance for both sides to marshal their arguments and make those arguments in public to the people. And we have a vote and we're further forward than we would have been otherwise.